Welcome to Southwest Desert, where adventure meets the arid beauty of the American Southwest. Join us as we explore the rugged landscapes, uncover hidden historical gems, and dive deep into the rich legends and culture of this iconic region. Subscribe now and hit the bell icon so you don't miss out on the latest desert adventures. Please leave a like or comment. This is very helpful. Let's journey together into the heart of the Southwest Desert. The year is 1862. Henry LeBeau and his ranch hand are driving cattle through a narrow canyon in Nevada's Paradise Range when they hear it, an unearthly moaning emanating from a cedar grove nearby. The ranch hand, a local tribesman, doesn't say a word. He simply turns his horse and gallops away. LeBeau, despite his European skepticism, feels a chill run down his spine. Without hesitation, he follows. Neither man ever returns to that canyon again, and both refuse to speak of what they heard that day. What made these hardened frontier men flee in terror? Was it merely the wind whistling through rock formations? Or was it something more? Perhaps the spectral guardians of one of the American West's most tantalizing lost treasures. Hidden within the rugged landscape of Nevada's Paradise Range lies a secret that has tantalized treasure hunters for over a century. In the northwestern quadrant of Nye County, amidst the jagged terrain surrounding Paradise Peak, there supposedly exists a cave unlike any other in the region. What makes this cavern unique isn't just its rumored contents, but its bizarre acoustics. The internal architecture of the cave allegedly creates strange, haunting sounds when the wind passes through its complex tunnel system, sounds that many have described as moaning, wailing, or howling, giving rise to the cave's ominous nickname. But long before European settlers arrived with their dreams of gold, this cave held profound significance for the indigenous peoples of the region. It wasn't the promise of wealth that made the location special to them, but its spiritual importance. The cave featured prominently in local tribal cosmology. The eerie sounds, which science would attribute to wind passing through the natural geological formations, were believed to be the voices of ancestral spirits. The location was considered sacred ground, with access strictly limited by tribal custom, and knowledge of its existence carefully preserved through oral traditions passed down through generations. When European settlers first arrived in Nevada territory, they encountered indigenous populations who viewed gold very differently than they did. For many Native American tribes, gold held little intrinsic value in their economic systems. It was too soft for tools and weapons, and while it could be used for ornamentation, other more accessible materials often served just as well. But as these indigenous groups observed the newcomers' obsession with the yellow metal and the violence that frequently accompanied it, they began to develop a more complex relationship with gold. They witnessed how settlers would kill for it, how they would destroy mountains to extract it, and how possession of it seemed to drive men to madness. As conflicts between settlers and indigenous peoples intensified, a fascinating strategy emerged among some tribal groups. Rather than engaging in direct and likely futile military confrontation, they opted for a more subversive approach. They would take the settlers' precious gold and hide it. This brings us to one of the most intriguing chapters in the Howling Cave legend, the Downeyville expedition ambush. In the early days of Nevada's mining boom, small settlements like Downeyville sprouted up wherever promising ore deposits were found. These primitive operations often lacked sophisticated refining capabilities, necessitating the transport of unprocessed gold, dust, nuggets, and flakes to larger facilities. According to local legend, sometime in the mid-1800s, a substantial gold shipment left Downeyville under armed escort. The security detail followed established transportation routes they believed to be safe. They were wrong. A group of indigenous warriors had gathered intelligence about the shipment schedule and had positioned themselves strategically along the transportation corridor. Their assault was swift and decisive. The armed escorts were overwhelmed and none survived to tell the tale. But this wasn't a random act of violence. It was a calculated operation with a specific purpose. After the confrontation, the warriors methodically collected the scattered gold materials. They didn't keep the gold for trading or personal wealth. Instead, they transported it collectively to their sacred cavern, the Howling Cave. There, in a ceremony that merged practical resistance with spiritual significance, they distributed the gold across the cave floor as a tribute to their deities. In this way, what began as a tactical response to European encroachment became imbued with spiritual meaning. The gold, so desperately desired by the settlers, would instead serve the indigenous gods, forever out of reach of those who killed for it. As decades passed and cultures mingled, some individuals found themselves straddling both worlds. Jimmy Graham was one such person, a resident of the small settlement of Berlin with indigenous heritage through his mother's line. Graham had grown up hearing his mother's stories about the sacred cave near Paradise Peak. She had told him of its extensive underground passages and confirmed what many suspected, that it contained a substantial cache of gold accumulated over years of resistance activities. But unlike his ancestors, Graham saw this not as sacred knowledge to be protected, but as an opportunity for personal enrichment. The cultural taboos that had kept the cave's location secret for generations meant little to him compared to the prospect of wealth. Graham identified an elderly woman from his mother's tribe who he believed possessed knowledge of the cave's exact location. His initial approaches were met with firm resistance. The location was sacred, not to be revealed to anyone, especially someone who clearly intended to violate its sanctity for profit. But Graham was persistent. Over months, he attempted to negotiate, offering essential European commodities as incentives. Eventually, he secured a compromise. The woman would help him retrieve some of the gold without actually revealing the cave's location. She would guide him close enough to obtain what he wanted, but the sacred site itself would remain protected. Nature, however, had other plans. The expedition began promisingly enough, with winter snow allowing Graham to track his guide's footprints. But as they ventured deeper into the Paradise Range, an unexpected warm spell brought rain, quickly transforming the snow into mud and completely eliminating their traceable path. The indigenous woman interpreted this sudden change in weather as divine intervention, the spirits protecting their sacred repository. Graham was left with nothing, and his guide, now even more convinced of the cave's spiritual protection, refused any further assistance or negotiation. Not all who sought the cave relied on negotiation. Another Berlin resident, known only as Ludwig in historical accounts, chose a far darker path. Ludwig had conducted his own independent investigation into the legend. He had explored portions of the Paradise Range and discovered ancient coins, which reinforced his belief in the substantial hidden wealth. Frustrated by his failure to locate the main repository, he decided more aggressive methods were needed. With an unnamed accomplice, Ludwig abducted an indigenous woman suspected of knowing the cave's location. Initial verbal interrogation yielded nothing. The woman remained steadfast in her silence. It was then that Ludwig made the horrific decision to employ torture. The woman was bound and suspended from a tree, a cruel method designed to induce both physical and psychological distress. Ludwig offered temporary relief as manipulation, promising her freedom in exchange for information. Despite the excruciating pain, the captive maintained her silence with extraordinary resilience. Even after a second application of the torturous suspension, she refused to betray her people's sacred trust. Eventually, Ludwig and his accomplice, perhaps shaken by the woman's incredible determination or fearing consequences should their actions be discovered, released her and abandoned their search. We now return to the encounter that opened our story, Henry LeBeau's brush with the unknown. LeBeau was no treasure hunter. He was a legitimate businessman, a pioneer ranching entrepreneur whose operations centered near the settlement of Ellsworth. His presence in the Paradise Range that fateful day was for entirely mundane reasons, routine cattle management with his indigenous employee. Their work had taken them deep into a canyon system near Paradise Peak when they encountered something that defied rational explanation. The moaning sounds that suddenly manifested seemed to originate from a specific cedar grove. LeBeau would later describe the sounds not as howling but as moaning, a distinction that experts suggest might relate to specific wind conditions affecting the cave's acoustic properties. The response from LeBeau's indigenous worker tells us much about the cave's reputation among local tribes. So what are we to make of the Howling Cave legend today? Is there really a fortune in gold hidden somewhere in the Paradise Range, or is this simply frontier folklore embellished over generations? Imagine you're standing in the Nevada desert beside crumbling adobe ruins of what was once a bustling desert station. The sun beats down mercilessly, and wind whispers through sagebrush. But here's what will make your heart race. Somewhere within a 4-mile radius of where you're standing, possibly just beneath your boots, lies a fortune hidden for over a century. We're talking about tens of thousands of dollars in gold coins and currency, buried by one of the most paranoid, miserly characters the American West ever produced. Welcome to the mystery of Pogue Station, where adobe walls guard secrets and the Nevada desert holds one of the most compelling unsolved treasure mysteries in American history. This is the story of Jim Pogue, a man so distrustful of humanity that he'd rather let his fortune rot in the desert than see another soul benefit from his wealth. Multiple people have found pieces of this treasure over the decades, proving it exists, but the main cache, it's still out there waiting. Let's dive into this incredible tale that begins with a robbery, a near-death experience, and the discovery that would make one man rich, and ultimately drive treasure hunters mad for generations. Our story begins before 1911, when a mysterious stranger appeared in the desolate stretch of Nevada desert where Nye, White Pine, and Eureka counties meet. Nobody knew where Jim Pogue came from. The region was a brutal, semi-waterless wasteland that claimed more lives than it sustained. One morning, while riding toward Duckwater, Pogue's world changed forever. 2 armed men emerged from the scrubland, stripped him of his possessions, beat him severely, and left him to die under the Nevada sun. Most men would have perished, but Pogue stumbled through the desert until he made an incredible discovery, a natural spring, bubbling fresh water in the middle of nowhere. Now here's where Pogue's genius shows itself. While most people would have simply been grateful for the life-saving water, Pogue saw dollar signs. In his dehydrated, desperate state, he realized he'd found liquid gold. This was the only reliable water source for miles in any direction, and in the desert, water meant power. When he announced his intention to build a station around the spring, the folks in Eureka and Duckwater laughed themselves silly. "Crazy old coot," they said. "Nobody's gonna stop at that god-forsaken spot." Pogue's response? "Laugh all you want, but I'll have the last laugh. You'll see." And with those words, he began building what would become one of the most profitable and hated businesses in Nevada. Using adobe mud and scavenged lumber, Pogue constructed his empire. He built a main station, barn, corrals, and outbuildings. The real genius came when he secured contracts with stage lines and freight companies. This was the only water stop for miles on the state route connecting Eureka and Duckwater. Then came the masterstroke. Pogue convinced Nye County to pay him daily for maintaining the public road. He'd created the perfect monopoly. His prices were steep: 25 cents to water your horse, 50 cents for a barely edible meal, and 50 cents to sleep on his property. You had no choice. He had the water. The conditions were legendarily awful. The place was filthy, the water tasted terrible, and the food was so bad that travelers universally felt justified trying to cheat Pogue. But there was nothing they could do. While Pogue charged premium prices, he spent virtually nothing. For food, he bartered with local Native American tribes, but for animal feed, he would hang tin cans along the road that rattled in the wind, spooking horses pulling hay wagons. When frightened animals bolted, they'd scatter hay bales which Pogue simply collected. "Why should I pay for anything?" he'd ask. "There's more than enough hay spilled out there." The only thing anyone saw him spend money on was chewing tobacco. Ed Halstead from Duckwater remembered Pogue's chin was perpetually stained brown, his trademark. But here's where the math gets interesting. Witnesses reported Pogue was taking in at least $100 daily during peak summers. Conservative estimates put his annual income at $25,000, equivalent to over $500,000 today. And where was all this money going? That's the question that would drive people crazy for the next century. For 3 years, business increased annually. That's when the rumors started. People in Duckwater told stories of seeing cash around the station, at least $25,000 in bags. Given Pogue's minimal expenses and substantial income, everyone became certain he was burying money in the desert. Pogue kept up his act. "I'm not making a penny. It takes everything I make to keep up this place." Nobody believed him. The math didn't add up. Then came the discovery that changed everything. An old prospector digging behind the station unearthed a can of coins. He burst into Duckwater crying that he'd found part of Pogue's fortune and thousands more out there just for the digging. Pogue's reaction: "That money isn't mine. It's just something that old fool dreamed up." But his denials fell on deaf ears. Men from town began a 2-week search. The treasure of Pogue Station was real. In late 1913, 2 young men arrived with a plan. They laid out a grid pattern and began systematic searching for 4 months, covering square after square until reaching the station itself. Pogue would watch them, even sold them supplies. When he discovered their purpose, he just laughed. "I don't have any money, never will have any." One returned the next summer trying to gain Pogue's confidence. The old man wasn't fooled. He trusted no one. By 1914, automobiles were appearing in the Southwest, spelling doom for Pogue's business. Because conditions were so terrible, locals were happy to eliminate the stop. As stage traffic fell, so did Pogue's income. The end came May 15, 1915. Jim Pogue died and they found not a single penny. 3 days later, Eureka County gave him a free burial. But we're talking about a man who made millions in today's money, spent almost nothing, never left the area, and died with empty pockets. Where did it all go? 2 years later, Duckwater men discovered coins under rocks near the station. News reverberated across Nevada. They tore out adobe walls and combed hundreds of yards of desert for 3 months. The most intriguing discovery came in 1936. John Hoyt, a California prospector, fell into a 5-foot hole. At his feet, a box containing $11 and a scrap of paper. $11. It was like Pogue laughing from the grave, just enough to keep hope alive, never enough to satisfy. Here's what makes this story compelling. The logic is airtight. Multiple witnesses confirmed Pogue's earnings. His expenses were minimal. No evidence he sent money away, no theft record, and he never left the area. The money must be within 4 miles of the station ruins. Why 4 miles? Pogue was always on hand for business, too paranoid to venture far. As one old-timer said, Pogue couldn't have spent the money. He didn't send it away. He wasn't robbed, and he didn't leave the area. So somebody's going to be digging out there and find the biggest darn fortune you ever saw. The partial discoveries prove the treasure exists. They're breadcrumbs left by a man so miserly he'd rather see his wealth buried forever than benefit another human being. Today, the adobe ruins of Pogue Station still stand in the Nevada desert, preserved by the dry climate that has changed little since 1915. The site remains largely as it was when Jim Pogue ruled his desert empire with an iron fist and a heart full of suspicion. Somewhere in that 4-mile radius, possibly in multiple locations, lies a fortune that conservative estimates place at $25,915, worth well over $500,000 today. And remember, that's the conservative estimate. Some believe it could be much, much more. If you would like to contribute to my channel, join my Patreon community and discover my art print products on my website in the links provided in my description. Also, if you would like a particular image from my videos, give the timestamp for the image, and I will upload it to my website and Patreon. Thank you. Picture this. You're holding a chunk of rock that looks like head cheese, clear quartz studded with gold nuggets, connected by threads of pure gold. It weighs nearly 10 pounds and assays at an astronomical $86,000 per ton. In 1896, just a dozen tons of this ore would make you a millionaire. But here's the catch. It's float ore, meaning it's broken away from its source. And despite over a century of searching by hundreds of prospectors, that source has never been found. This is the story of Charles Lamson's lost gold, one of Nevada's most enduring mysteries. In the lonely Monte Cristo Mountains of southern Nevada lies Crow Springs, a name barely appearing on modern maps, forgotten by time. But at the dawn of the 20th century, this remote watering hole pulsed with the frantic energy of America's last great gold rush. When Jim Butler made his spectacular silver strike at Tonopah Springs in 1900, the Carson and Colorado Railroad became the only lifeline to civilization. Old Sodaville, 60 miles northwest on the railroad, became the gateway to fortune. Crow Springs thrived as the essential waypoint, echoing day and night with Concord stages, freight wagons, and thousands of fortune seekers following ancient Indian trails toward their dreams. Our story begins in 1896, before Tonopah existed. Charles Lamson was a restless freelancer who made his living playing fiddle at valley dances and following his prospector's instincts. He lived in Pahranagat Valley, but frequently traveled to Candelaria, where his sister and brother-in-law Owen Owens lived in the established silver camp. Recently, Lamson's trips had taken on new urgency. He'd fallen for 17-year-old Flora Iola Gilbert, whose family represented everything authentic about Nevada's mining culture. Patriarch John Benton Gilbert had crossed the plains in 1865 and never stopped searching for the big strike. He'd made and lost 3 fortunes in lead silver mining, but his wife never wavered. "You'll strike it again." Their sons, Fred and Logan Gilbert, had literally been born in a prospect hole and were developing reputations as skilled prospectors with uncanny ability to read ore. In late May 1896, Lamson bid farewell to the Gilbert family at Rive, promising to return from Candelaria within 2 weeks. It was a promise he would spectacularly fail to keep. The trail to Candelaria was familiar, but Lamson couldn't resist prospecting along the way. Near Crow Springs, he discovered copper and lead veins that showed promise. He summoned Owen Owens from Candelaria to investigate. The 2 men examined the veins for days, but their assessment was disappointing. The deposits were small and unlikely to pay off. They were preparing to abandon the effort when Lamson made a discovery that would haunt the Monte Cristo Mountains for over a century. There, lying on the ground like a gift from the gods, was a chunk of rock unlike anything either man had ever seen. Clear quartz shot through with gold nuggets, connected by veins of pure gold. When Lamson finally returned to Rive, More than a month overdue, he was a changed man. Disturbed and disappointed, he sat down with John Gilbert and revealed his incredible secret. "Well, I have found gold," he announced, "but I've had to give it up. I can't find where it came from." The ore specimen left the Gilbert family speechless. Weighing 8 to 9 pounds, it was solid gold-bearing quartz that assayed at $86,000 per ton, a value so astronomical it defied belief. But there was crushing reality. The ore was float, broken away from its source. Despite 2 weeks of intensive searching with Owen Owens, using every frontier prospecting technique, they had failed to locate the mother lode. Lamson's frustration was palpable. They had searched and hammered and panned for 2 solid weeks, forgetting everything else in their obsession. But the golden threads led nowhere, and eventually Owen Owens gave up and returned to Candelaria. Recognizing his failure, Lamson made a decision that would launch one of the West's most persistent treasure hunts. He trusted the Gilbert family and wanted them to have the opportunity he couldn't capitalize on. His directions were specific. Go to San Antone Station. Old Man Bell will point out Crow Springs, about 30 miles away, due west. When you get there, go to that little hill about 3.5 miles southeast. I picked up this ore right on the saddle on that hill. But Lamson's honesty about his failure was equally specific. I've panned all around it and couldn't find a color. John Gilbert and partner Homer Thompson wasted no time. As soon as they could outfit themselves, they headed for Crow Springs with Gilbert's portable assay equipment. They easily found Lamson's hill. His directions proved accurate, but results were devastating. The best ore ran only $7 per ton in silver, not gold. They established base camp at Crow Springs and searched in widening circles, finding no sign of Lamson's gold. However, 8 miles southwest in the Monte Cristos, they discovered traces of old workings and a silver-lead outcrop that became the Carey Mine. On August 20th, 1897, Gilbert moved his family there but never abandoned searching for Lamson's gold, periodically returning to camp at Crow Springs and hunt the elusive ledge. When Butler's strike ignited the Tonopah boom in 1900, the landscape around Crow Springs transformed overnight. The Gilbert family moved to Tonopah in 1901 as the rush intensified. The Sodaville-Tonopah Road epitomized frontier spirit. Legend says Bob Stewart simply set off for Tonopah in his buckboard, freighters followed his tracks, and the road was in business. No engineers, no commissions, just frontier pragmatism. During boom years, dust scarcely settled on this route, so constant was the traffic. Mr. and Mrs. Humphrey at Crow Springs often served 200 people daily at 50 cents per meal. As Lamson's story spread through Nevada's mining communities, more travelers paused to try their luck at finding the Phantom Ledge. In 1918, Fred and Logan Gilbert found themselves in Tonopah with time available. They decided to take one more look for the lost gold. About a mile from Crow Springs, on a distinctive reddish-pink quartz hill with twin peaks, Fred noticed 2 old location monuments. In a rusted baking powder can, he found a location notice dated June 6, 1896, signed by Charles Lamson and Owen Owens. The discovery was tantalizing proof the story was real, but revealed nothing about the gold source's whereabouts. The following year brought unexpected opportunity. Charles Lamson, now aging, appeared in Tonopah. When the Gilbert brothers mentioned finding the monuments, they convinced the old prospector to return to Crow Springs one final time. Early that morning, as sunlight glistened on the twin-peaked hill, Lamson pointed directly to it. "You see those 2 little peaks? My brother-in-law was driving the wagon that day, and I was walking off to the side looking for float. It was either just below those hills or to the right." At the hill, Lamson stuck his pick in the ground with absolute certainty. "This is the spot where I found that ore. My monuments ought to be right around here somewhere." Fred wordlessly showed him the old monuments. Lamson's memory had been precise. They were exactly where he indicated. But this confirmation came with a stunning revelation explaining decades of fruitless searching. Lamson had originally told John Gilbert he'd found the ore 3.5 miles from Crow Springs. That's where generations of prospectors had concentrated efforts, but the monuments were only about 1 mile from the springs. That completely puzzled us, Fred Gilbert later recalled. The discovery represented a new lease on the old story, but revealed the fundamental error that had misdirected searchers for over 20 years. The ground around the Twin Peaks was covered with brecciated rock, coarse-grained tannish material mixed with quartz. The Gilbert brothers attacked it with rock crushers and hand pans, processing tons of material. Despite intensive efforts, they didn't get a color. Ultimate vindication of the Monte Cristo Mountains' gold potential came in September 1924, when Fred, Logan, and Herman Gilbert made a strike that precipitated Nevada's last substantial gold rush. Their discovery established the short-lived camp of Gilbert, and the principal mine, the Black Mammoth, produced selected ore running $96,000 per ton, even richer than Lamson's find. The irony wasn't lost on Fred Gilbert. What gets us is that thousands of people walked right over Gilbert during the Tonopah and Goldfield booms, but nobody would pan that quartz. But the Gilbert brothers were quick to point out their discovery wasn't the source of Lamson's ore. The Black Mammoth ore was entirely different in character, proving the Monte Cristos contained multiple sources of incredibly rich gold. So where is Lamson's gold? The Gilbert brothers eventually concluded the golden ore must have been dropped on the hill by some traveling Indian, but this theory simply raised new questions. Where did the Indian find the $86,000 ore? A human skull sat on John Pence's mantelpiece for decades, not as a macabre decoration, but as a haunting reminder of one of the American West's most tantalizing lost treasures. That skull belonged to a nameless soul who died guarding a fortune in gold, a fortune that still lies hidden in Nevada's unforgiving wilderness, where modern-day adventurers continue to search for what has become known as the lost skeleton gold. Welcome to Southwest Desert. Today, we venture into the rugged borderlands where Nevada meets Idaho to unravel a tale of incredible wealth, sudden death, and secrets carried to the grave. It's a story that spans nearly 150 years, threading through the boom and bust cycles of the American mining frontier, where fortunes could be made with a single swing of a pick, or lost just as quickly in the harsh embrace of an unforgiving land. The story begins in the late 1870s, in a landscape that defies easy description. From the old stage station of North Fork, a graded road strikes out northeasterly into this forbidding terrain. It's a desolate path that serves no towns and only a few scattered cabins. The road crosses the West Fork of the Bruneau River, passing through the ghost town of Charleston, where weathered buildings stand as silent sentinels to dreams long abandoned. It was in this untamed wilderness that two Mormon prospectors first discovered gold, in an era when the American West still held endless possibilities for those brave or foolish enough to seek them. These men, whose names have been lost to history, were part of a larger expedition seeking potential farmland in the Bruneau Basin. But what they found instead would set in motion a chain of events that would captivate treasure hunters for generations. The Mormon prospectors built a small arastra, a primitive ore-crushing mill, and began working their claim in secret. Their church leaders looked upon gold mining as an unsuitable occupation, so they kept their discovery quiet, appearing periodically in the towns of Elko and Tuscarora to sell their gold in small lots. They were careful never to draw too much attention to their operation, operating in the shadows of the mountains that would soon become their final resting place. For you see, The harsh country they worked in had its own plans. One day, the Mormon prospectors simply stopped appearing in town. Their fate remains unknown, perhaps buried by one of the region's notorious avalanches, or claimed by any of the 1,000 natural hazards that awaited the unwary in this unforgiving terrain. Their discovery became the first of many secrets the mountains would keep. The story might have ended there, if not for a stage driver's lucky find in 1885. This unnamed driver, making his regular run through the high country, picked up a piece of ore that caught his eye. He took it to his employers, Scott and Hanks, and asked them to have it assayed. The results were staggering. The sample was, in the parlance of the day, fabulously rich in gold. The stage driver immediately left his job to return to the mountains in search of more. Like so many others who ventured into these peaks seeking fortune, he was never seen again. In those days, the region was nearly 100 miles from the nearest source of supplies. The few prospectors who dared to venture into this high, remote country faced not only isolation, but also the very real threat of death from exposure, starvation, or accident. News of disappearances rarely triggered searches. The country was too vast, too rugged, and too dangerous for rescue parties to have much hope of success. Yet it's not these early disappearances that give the lost skeleton gold its name. That part of the tale begins in 1890 with a prospector known only as Ross. As summer began to fade into autumn, Ross had followed a trail of float rock pieces of gold-bearing ore that had broken off from a larger deposit high into the mountains. The float was, by all accounts, fantastically rich, suggesting a mother lode of incredible value. Ross spent weeks methodically tracking the float up the mountainside, testing each piece, following the golden trail higher and higher into the thin air of the high country. He was close to finding its source when the first warning signs of winter appeared, dark clouds gathering around the peaks, and that peculiar hush that settles over high country when snow is imminent. Knowing the dangers of being trapped in these mountains during winter, Ross made the prudent decision to leave. But before departing, he did two things that would prove fateful. First, he drove his pick and shovel into the ground to mark his claim. Second, he stopped at a nearby sheep camp where he met a herder named Ishman. The sheep camp belonged to John Pence and was situated on the east bank of the Jarbidge River. Perhaps it was loneliness from weeks of solitude, or perhaps some premonition that he would never return, but Ross did something unusual for a prospector. He shared the details of his discovery with Ishman. He described the canyon where he'd found the float, explained how he'd spent half the summer tracing it to its source, and even told the sheep herder that if he didn't return in spring, the claim would belong to him. When spring finally arrived and the snow began to retreat, Ishman made his way up to Ross's claim. What he found there would become the stuff of legend. Ross's tools were exactly where he'd said they would be, but lying beside them was a complete human skeleton, picked clean by the elements and mountain scavengers. Though the bones had been scattered by animals, the skeleton appeared to be complete, save for what would later become its most famous part. The sheep herder spent his entire summer searching for the source of Ross's golden float rock, all while tending his flock. It was painstaking work for someone with no mining experience. For days at a time, he would think he had lost the lead, only to find another small piece of ore heavily impregnated with gold, launching his search anew. Finally, after weeks of methodical searching, Ishman's persistence paid off. He discovered what he was looking for, an outcropping of rock laced with veins of gold so rich they would later assay at over $4,000 per ton, an astronomical sum in the 1890s. But summer was already waning, and snow-laden clouds had begun to hover around the summits. The lonely wind that licked at the yellowing aspens carried the bitter promise of winter. Ishman carefully concealed his discovery, covering the outcropping with dead brush and removing Ross's tools to hide any trace of the location. But he didn't leave empty-handed. In a decision that would add to the growing legend, he took the skull from the skeleton as a rather macabre souvenir. Back at the ranch, Ishman showed his employer, John Pence, both the skull and samples of the ore. The samples were so rich that even the most conservative assayer confirmed their extraordinary value. The poorest specimens contained more than $4,000 in gold per ton. Yet despite endless questions from his employer, Ishman never revealed the exact location of the strike. He kept promising to take Pence there when the weather permitted, but winter in the high country was long and harsh. Throughout that winter, Pence and Ishman talked of little else but the golden ledge waiting in the mountains. Yet whenever Pence tried to pin down the exact location, Ishman would deflect, saying only that he would take him there when conditions allowed. When spring finally arrived, the two men set out for the site. Ishman, typically reserved, was nearly manic with excitement as they climbed higher into the mountains. His pace grew faster and faster as they ascended into the cold, thin air of the high country, his powerful drive seeming to overcome the natural limitations of human endurance. But fate, it seems, had other plans. As they climbed, Ishman suddenly collapsed, clutching his head. Despite Pence's heroic efforts to get him down the mountain and to a doctor in Mountain City, a journey of 100 miles by horse and wagon over rough terrain, Ishman died a few days later from a cerebral hemorrhage. He never regained consciousness, and the secret of the mine's location died with him. John Pence refused to give up. Over the years, he spent thousands of dollars grub-staking prospectors to search for the lost mine, always sending them into the same wild region where he believed the gold lay hidden. Some never returned from their searches, presumably claimed by the harsh environment or winter storms. Others tried using spiritualists to contact Ross or Ishman in the afterlife, all to no avail. The story of the lost skeleton gold might have faded into obscurity if not for what happened in 1908. That's when D.A. Bourne and his wife, making their way home to Boise, Idaho, discovered what would become the famous Bourne Strike, a gold deposit so rich it would help transform the tiny settlement of Jarbidge from a handful of log cabins into a booming mining camp of 3,000 people. The Bourne discovery sparked a rush that would change the face of the region forever. By February 1910, more than 500 people had made their way to Jarbidge, despite its isolation and the difficulties of supplying such a remote location. Most buildings were constructed of pine logs, though 7 of the business houses were built of dressed lumber that had to be brought in by burro. For a time, people thought Bourne had found Ishman's lost mine, but careful analysis showed his strike was at least 5 miles away and much lower on the range than Ross and Ishman's discovery. The Bourne strike would help Jarbidge produce between $50 and $60 million in gold before the mines were shut down by the War Production Board in 1942. But the lost skeleton gold, it remained hidden. The mystery of the lost skeleton gold has only grown with time. Somewhere in those rugged mountains beneath the alpine fir and limber pine lies a headless skeleton. Above it, according to legend, waits a gold deposit rich enough to make modern prospectors weak in the knees. But the questions remain. Whose bones are those? Was it Ross himself? A partner he might have killed? Or someone else entirely who stumbled upon the claim? In the end, perhaps the true value of the lost skeleton gold lies not in its monetary worth, but in its power to remind us of the extraordinary dreams and desperate gambles that shaped the American West. It stands as a testament to the courage, greed, and determination of those who ventured into these mountains seeking their fortunes, and to the harsh beauty of a landscape that continues to guard its secrets with unwavering vigilance. Thank you for joining your desert frontiersman Alan for another Southwest Lost Gold story. Check out my large catalog of Southwest videos and playlists on historical tales, legends, lost gold stories, and adult bedtime stories. Happy trails! Thanks for watching. If you enjoyed this video, don't forget to like, comment, share, and subscribe for more great content. Hit the notification bell so you never miss an update. See you in the next video.